when it's going to open again. Anyway, this is the story of Polegate Windmill from the very beginning. Now, when the Eastbourne District Preservation Committee was formed, two of the items they looked at which needed attention was Pocock's cottages and also the Polegate Windmill, because both of them were in need of saving, really, preserving. So Polegate Windmill was owned by Mr. Ovenden, the last miller, and in 1962 he decided to sell it, and there was interest from developers who would have demolished it and then built a housing estate there. But he wanted it preserved, and he knew about the Eastbourne District Preservation Committee and approached them in the form of Mr. Clack, Ronald Clack, the chairman, and eventually it was decided that the Eastbourne District Preservation Society would purchase the windmill and restore it to working order. In order to do that, a new trust had to be formed, Eastbourne District Preservation Trust, and that's the body that actually owns the windmill. Eventually, of course, the Eastbourne District Preservation Committee transformed into the Eastbourne District Preservation Society, and then the Eastbourne Civic Society, and then the Eastbourne Society, which we have now. So it's a bit convoluted, but that's how it transpired. And during this period of time, particularly in the 1990s, it was the committee looking after the windmill decided to break away from the Eastbourne Society and formed a separate organisation. So that's why the Eastbourne District Preservation Trust is a separate entity to the Eastbourne Society now. Anyway, that's the background to the ownership of the windmill. So I'll just go through it and explain about how it came to be in its current position, current condition. So first of all, we have to realise that the windmill replaced an earlier one on the top of the downs here, there, and that was called actually Willingdon Windmill. And there's some pressure at the moment for Polegate Windmill to revert to the title of Willingdon Windmill. But of course a lot of people know it as Polegate Windmill, so there's a bit of reluctance to change the name. Anyway, this is the original Willingdon Windmill. It's destroyed in a storm March 1817. This was painted by Lady Sophia Bowl, and as you can see, it's on the top of the downs, somewhat less populated with trees in this photograph. And then there's stories about the windmill as there are about other buildings, that they were frequented by smugglers. And we have in the windmill archive a picture of the smugglers in 1787 taking contraband over the downs and storing it in the windmill. Rumour has it that eventually the goods turned up at the 8 Bells at Jevington, where it was sort of distributed. Anyway, I've put the famous part of the poem by Rudyard Kipling along the top, which referred to the smugglers. That was called the Smuggler's Poem. If you want to read the whole of the poem, I suggest you go to the Beachy Head Centre, where they've got it on display there. So, as the original Willingdon Windmill was blown down in 1817, Joseph Seymour, who owned that windmill, decided to have a new one built further down on the lower slopes. And that's how we've got Polegate Windmill, but it was called Willingdon Windmill when first built. So it's built in 1817, and this is a painting by Edwin Byatt, quite a famous painting, lots of postcards produced of it. The original is with the Medici Society in London, in Kensington, and this is the windmill as it was, fairly well known there. Now, when it was first built, it only had 2 pairs of stones, the grindstones inside, which consist of a top stone called the runner stone and a bottom stone called the bedstone, to grind the grain into flour. There was only 2 sets in the windmill. But later on, because of the increase in demand for stone ground flour in the area, particularly for bakeries such as Venner's and Turner's, it was decided to put another pair of stones in, and this was fitted in 1862. We know that because underneath it has got 1862 on the casting. This company, S. Medhurst and Son, was a Lewis millwrights. In Lewis, they made all sorts of machinery for windmills and for watermills, and in fact, quite a number of watermills in the area had S. Medhurst and Sons on them. The other thing about S. Medhurst is that in St Anne's churchyard in Lewis, there's all the grave markers for the families are all made of cast iron, made in the same foundry. So this is the arrangement underneath the third pair of stones, as we called it, in addition to the two originally fitted in 1817 when the mill was built. Now, you might find it strange to see an airship, but this is 100 years since the mill was built. In 1917, you were more likely to see airships around from the Polegate airship station, and this is quite an interesting photo because we've got Polegate Windmill in the same photograph. It's not a very clear photo, but that's the only one that's available at the moment. To see the airship in a better shape is this one here, but there's no windmill, it's to the right. So again, you can see the downs are fairly clear of undergrowth. So there's lots of stories about the airships and lots of publications, but this would be the sort of scene that one would see in 1917, 100 years after the mill was built. It went through various owners, so Joseph Seymour was the first owner, and then there's the Mockets and the Thomases, and latterly the Ovendons. And E is for Ephraim, so Ephraim Ovenden bought the mill in about 1917, about the time we're talking about, and this is one of his bills of sale to a gentleman who was buying flour from the windmill. So it's from Polegate, East Sussex, by Mr. Ovenden. I think it's Mr. Pierce there. Anyway, 1931 is the date of this invoice for stone ground flour. Also in the vicinity was the watermill, lower watermill here. That was built in 1834, and it's about 200 or 300 yards from the windmill. The water for this, the stream, comes from the downs, from the aquifers, and it goes through the glen, past Wallach Watermill, down to Willingdon Watermill. This was owned by Mr. Ovenden as well, but is now completely disappeared, except for the water wheel, which is housed in here. That went to another mill in Kent called Waterbury soon after we took the windmill over. Mr. Ovenden was quite keen to sell us the watermill as well, but there was no machinery inside it, so it wouldn't have been very useful for visitors. Whereas Polegate Windmill itself has got all the machinery in it as in the original design. Now also there was Wallach Watermill, which was between the Glen and the lower watermill at Polegate, or Willingdon as it was then. This building is still here, but highly modified, so you don't recognise it as a watermill. Latterly it was part of the Old Mill Gardens, not the Wallach Gardens, that was the other side of the road, and so consequently the Old Mill Gardens was named after this mill, and lots of people used to go there, lots of coach parties and private individuals. I was actually born about a quarter of a mile from the watermill in the Willowbrook Cottages along the main road. So this is Polegate Windmill in its heyday. This would be about 1920. A commercial postcard. There were many postcards produced which were sold to various shops and things. And this is by Shoesmith and Etheridge, one of the main postcard producers. The other producers, of course, were Judges in Hastings and lots of other postcard manufacturers in various other parts of the country. You can pick these up, of course, at postcard fairs, and one or two of them have been reproduced so that to sell to the population now. So this is the mill at Polegate. So it's interesting, that is not the mill at Willingdon, it's the mill at Polegate. This is another photograph taken by a gentleman called H.E.S. Symonds, who was a prolific visitor to different mills. He was a very keen enthusiast of windmills and water mills, and he made copious records which are quite useful for going back in time to the water mills and windmills of this country, some of which of course are no longer with us. So it's quite a useful list, and most of the records from Mr. Symonds' collection are in the mill archive in Reading. So in Reading there's the mill's archive where you can go and visit and look through all the different records there. So E. Ovenden and Son was the owners of the windmill from about 1920 onwards, and this is one of their paper flour bags. It's called Parkcroft Windmill here. So as I say, it had many names, and this is Ovenden's. And Mr. Ovenden, Ephraim Ovenden, died, and his son Albert took over and ran the mill, except for the period during the war. Now, during the war, some of the timber in the cap needed replacing, but he couldn't get it because of the war effort, and so therefore he had to revert to using electricity. So he installed an electric motor at the bottom of the mill and used that to drive just the one pair of stones, which was sufficient to serve the local population. Some of the flour by now was not really suitable for making bread because of the different regulations, health regulations. So most of the flour during the war and afterwards was sold to the local population for chicken feed or animal feed. And in fact, my grandmother used to go round and get bags of flour from Mr. Ovenden, and I had a task of mashing it all up with the potatoes to feed to the chickens. And so I well remember doing that from Mr. Ovenden's flour. So later on, this is September 1950, all the area around the mill was being developed with housing because Mr. Ovenden didn't need the wind anymore because he had this electric motor, and that lasted until he retired in 1962. The electric motor long since gone, but we have another electric motor on the ground floor now driving some of the ancillary machinery. There were some prefabs over to the right from this picture. This is from the main, well, what used to be the A22, looking up towards the windmill. This is the engine shed here, which you'll see again later, but over to the right were the prefabs, which have now gone, and there's new houses being built there. So we now get to 1962. Mr. Ovenden had decided to sell the mill, and the Eastbourne District Preservation Society decided to give an appeal out and raise some money to purchase it, to save it being demolished and sort of lost forever. So here is a leaflet, and various people here, quite notable people in the Eastbourne area, supported the mill, and also East Sussex County Council and all the others. And quite interesting, Rank Holmes McDoodle gave quite a substantial donation towards the purchase and restoration of the mill. The mill cost £1,000 to buy. This was way below its market price for the land, but Mr. Ovenden wanted to see it preserved. We spent another several £1,000s on restoring it, of course, because the sweeps had to be renewed and various internal modifications done. To get from one floor to the other in the mill, there was a set of ladders which obviously wasn't going to be suitable for the general public visiting the mill. They had to be replaced by stairs. Even though they're fairly steep, at least they're better than the ladders. So that's the original appeal leaflet, which went out to all the local area. And one of the, apart from Ronald Clack, one of the key people who was helping with the raising the money was Lawrence Stevens. Here he is, looking very young, of course, and he's receiving a cheque from the comedian Sandy Powell, who, as you probably know, often appeared on the pier, in the Pier Theatre. So he's given a cheque across to Lawrence Stevens, who was the appeal organiser. Now, Mrs. Terry, who is the daughter of the last miller, Albert Ovenden, wrote a book, Childhood Memories of Polegate Windmill and Watermills. And this is the frontispiece showing Albert Ovenden working in the mill, putting grain into the hopper and receiving the ground flour at the bottom of the spout. So it's quite a useful book if anyone's interested. It's been long out of print, but you can probably get it in second-hand bookshops. Now, as I mentioned, the mill came under the auspices of the Eastbourne District Preservation Society, and various newsletters were produced highlighting the mill and various other things like the Star Brewery site. So this is the 1966 winter edition, and it's reporting that the floor and the flooring and the stairs are being done. There's a delay in this. This was entrusted to Mr. Hole, Mr. Edwin Hole of Burgess Hill, who was the millwright that was engaged to overhaul and restore the mill in the first place. A lot of the minor tasks were, of course, carried out by volunteers, but the main heavy work was done by the millwrights, Edwin Hole, who are no longer in business. So this is the 1966 newsletter of the Eastbourne District Preservation Society. Mr. Hole had quite a difficult task to restore the mill because the cap had to be lifted up in order to run out some of the timbers, which were rotten because the timbers hadn't been repaired for many years. In fact, the reason in 1942, during the war, that Mr. Ogden had to install an electric motor was because some of the timbers up in the top cap had rotted to some extent, and he couldn't get the replacement timbers. So Mr. Hole surrounded the mill with scaffolding, and he made up this jack here, metal jack. So pushing down on the ground lifted the wind shaft so that the weight was relieved on the top of the cap, and therefore work could be undertaken underneath it. So this is 1967. We was hoping to open the mill in 1967 in July, because that was 150 years since the mill was first built in 1817. And we managed to do that and got the Duke of Devonshire to officially open it. So this is Andrew, the 11th Duke of Devonshire, with the golden key. We've still got the golden key in a little box, and you can go and see it when the mill is ever open. You can go and see it near the original mill entrance. There it is there, the golden key. So it's a polished wooden case with a glass front, so you can actually look in it and see it. So after the initial restoration, it was open to the public on the 1st of July 1967, and lots of people started to come. We had many visitors in the early days, because it was fairly unusual to be able to go inside a windmill. There were other windmills already in opening mode, but most of them were in the Midlands and the north of England. There's also a wagon here which was donated by the Chatsworth estate. That eventually, I'm afraid, succumbed to rot and had to be dismantled in the end. Now the cap on the top here rotates to keep it into the wind with the fantail at the back. So the fantail at the back catches the wind when the wind changes direction, and it moves the cap around, so you can always have the wind blowing on the front of the sweeps. You must have wind blowing on the front here to make it work properly. If it turned round and blew from the back, there's a danger of it tailwinding, that is blowing the cap off. And many mills in the old days were tailwinded when the wind changed direction without the cap following the direction of the wind. So this couldn't rotate at the time, and that's why there's a skeleton fan there rather than a fully bladed fan. Later on, of course, you'll see later that we rectified that by removing the cap and replacing the curb down the top. So in order to make it easy for people to come to the windmill, various leaflets were printed each year to show where it was. So here is Polegate Windmill in Parkcroft. This is the A22 as it was then, and over here is Bonnet Gardens. We were advising people to go there for their teas because we didn't have any catering facilities at the mill itself. So this, I'm not sure what date this leaflet is. As you can see, the adults are 2 shillings. So it must be fairly soon after it opened, 1967. So in order to help people navigate through the mill, drawings were made and various things inserted into a guidebook. We produced a guidebook so that people could have a look round and follow the guide. When we first opened, we had quite a number of people coming, as I mentioned, and so we had guides on each floor. So people came in the bottom. It was always necessary to go to the top first because you're following the route of the grain passing through the mill to be ground into flour on the stones here, on the millstones. So everyone was asked to go to the top, and then the guides would tell you what to see and what you could see and give a bit of indication of the history. So this drawing was done by Frank Gregory, and then because I'm a draftsman, I replaced his sketch with a proper drawing on the drawing board. And this is still printed to this day, this guide. And also did some drawings of the various parts of the mill that people might want further clarification on. So these are the stones. So the top stone is called the runner stone, bottom stone is the bed stone. One goes round, crushes the flour. So the flour is the grain, goes in the middle here from the hopper, and then it comes round the outside as stone ground flour. So that's how it works. And then there's a description in the guidebooks to give visitors an idea of how it actually works. And this is fairly common for most windmills and indeed watermills in the different parts of the country. And we also have a drawing in the guidebook about the tentering arrangement. This is fairly complicated. It compensates for the change in wind speed, because unlike a watermill, a windmill doesn't go regularly at the same speed because it depends on the gusts of wind. So if the wind increases in speed, these governors fly out like a ball on the end of a piece of string. They fly out, and this lanyard here comes up and drops this end down, lowers the stone, the top stone, onto the bottom stone and compensates for the difference in speed. The idea is to keep it all running at the same speed, but that's not really possible in a windmill. Whereas in a watermill, you could adjust the penstock to let the water in, and that would allow you to have a constant speed of the stones. So as I say, when the mill was first built, there was just the 2 pairs of stones, and then later on in 1862, a 3rd pair was added. But that wasn't driven in the same manner as this, because there wasn't any room in the mill to have additional gearing. The 3rd pair of stones was belt driven, as you'll see later, because it was a later addition. Anyway, he officially opened it the following year at 3 p.m. So this is everyone's been invited who are interested in windmills by Gilbert Foyle, who was one of our directors of the windmill. So this is the Milling Museum, the interior of it. after all the exhibits had been put in. This is one of the original fans from the back before the skeleton was added, and this is a model of Polegate Windmill, 1/24th scale exactly, which was constructed by one of our volunteers, Mr. Waite. So this, as I say, used to be a storeroom, but the roof was rather dodgy, so that had to be rebuilt before we could open it as a milling museum. Also, it enabled us to find a space for Mr. Gregory's model of a post mill. He was a carpenter, teaching carpentry over in Brighton, and he'd made this model just out of interest to show the students how the models could be made of a windmill. But he didn't have anywhere really to keep it. So it was quite useful that the Milling Museum was opened in 1968, so we provided a space for it, and it's still there in the Milling Museum. Now, in order to keep the money coming in, apart from that taken by the visitors, given by the visitors, we had various events during the year, and this is one of them is the fete, annual fete, opened by various people that we could persuade to come to the windmill and officially open the fete. And this was by Walter Landauer. Some of you are of a certain age will probably remember Walter Landauer as part of the Landau and Ravitch piano people, and used to appear on the pier. And so he opened that. We've had various people coming to open the fete each year. Sometimes we run out of ideas and just have to open it ourselves. But this is the one in 1972. Now, unfortunately, the following year, Albert Ovenden died, and so the funeral had to pass. We arranged for it to pass the mill, and by tradition, when a miller dies, the sweeps are put in what we call the mourning position, and this was done for this, hence the tribute to Albert. This is still done today, these days, for people associated with windmills who have passed away. Now, by autumn 1974, the newsletter is now Eastbourne Civic Society, having replaced Eastbourne District Preservation Society, and various comments are made in the magazine about the windmill. So the windmill attracts about 2,500 visitors each year, and many of these come from schools. Now, we did have quite a number of schools coming to the windmill in the early days, but unfortunately that all declined when they found that they had to pay quite a lot of money for insurance and for the coaches, because many of them come from London. Many of the groups came from London, the schools, and I used to organise the school visits, but we haven't really had any schools for many, many years now. There's no one available. So we try to accommodate the schools during the week, which also is difficult, or was difficult, because many of our guides were working and they could only afford to have time off at the weekend. Now, 10 years later, we decided that we should continue to enhance the mill. Perhaps we better put back the gallery. So this is the gallery. The doors each side come out, or always used to come out, onto a gallery, which enabled you to get to the sweeps, to do any repairs, and also the striker chain, which is the chain hanging down the back of the mill, which allows you to adjust the angle of the sweeps, the angle of the shutters in the sweeps. So this was all constructed in 1983 by our volunteers, with these bits being put in. The holes were already there, of course, because they always had a gallery in the past, but that had disappeared many years ago. So this is August 1983. And then 4 years later, 1987, it was decided to do quite a major job of replacing the cap, taking the cap off, replacing the curb around the top that the cap runs on, and doing quite a major job on the windmill. We had obviously to raise a lot of money because cranes aren't cheap to hire, so we had to hire some cranes. Lawrence Stevens organised all this with various organisations and companies, and he also made this time scale so that people could see what was happening. This was posted to all the local houses so they could understand what was happening at the mill. So first of all, the cap had to be the sweeps taken off, and then the cap taken off and put on the ground, and then the cap put back again, and then the sweeps put back again, and in November 1987, it was planned that the sweeps would be finished and all ready to go. Unfortunately, October 1987, we had a hurricane. So, so fortunately, we didn't have the sweeps on by then, so it didn't really affect us. But it did affect some of the other areas around, and various trees were taken down, were cut down as well. So that is the plan for 1987, and here is the cap being lifted off by crane in the August and lowered down onto the ground. So this would have been the first time the cap had been removed since it was put there in 1817. It wouldn't have been put there with a crane, of course. It would have been constructed in situ on the top of the tower. So the tower, the brick tower, has a curb round the top which is cast iron, and the cap has rollers underneath here which enable it to turn into the wind. As you can see, there's no sweeps on because we tried to take as much off as we could before we remove the cap. So here's a view looking down. This is taken from the crane, looking down inside, and this shows the brickwork along the top here, all around the top, which has got to be cleaned off in order to put a new curb on. So the curb, as I say, is cast iron, made up of 8 pieces, and that's what the cap rolls round on. It's supported by the curb. So the parts that were taken off, which were a bit dodgy because they had cracks in them, are now in the museum at Polegate Windmill, because we had new ones made, and this is the pattern that was made, a wooden pattern, to go to the foundry in order to make the new castings. And this is the old pinion arrangement, which is no longer needed because we had a new one made. So most of the cap arrangement was always all renewed. So the molten iron here is being poured into the sand mould at Rye Foundry. Rye Foundry, of course, no longer there, but this was where the new parts were made for the mill. The cap, meantime, was put on the ground. Fortunately, we have a piece of ground attached to the mill, which belongs to the Preservation Trust, and that was put on the mill. And this was all repaired and refurbished by millwrights from Lincolnshire, because we were a bit short of millwrights in this area. Sometimes the millwrights are here or are available, but very heavily committed to other windmills. So we always have to try and use what we can. You can see the gallery is now constructed with the handrail there. And here is the cap being lifted up and put back on the top of the mill with this crane. So this is in November, I think, 87. Put it back, and then the sweeps had to be added later. Now this is looking up, this is inside the mill looking up. These are the new pieces of metal which has been cast, and this is what we call the truck wheels, which keeps the cap central as it rotates round, being powered by the fantail. And here's a view looking down. This is the following year, 2 years later, May 1989, when the other sweeps were being put back on. So there's various sweeps laying about all around the mill, and these are all put back on and clamped into position. Now this is an earlier picture actually showing the wagon that was donated by Chatsworth Estate, but I'm just using this as an illustration that between this part of the building and that part, This is what we call the malt house, and that is the engine shed. So that was the engine shed which was used by the local authority to keep their steamroller in. But the gap between was asking for a building to be put in so we could join it all up together. And this is the new building, which was fitted in 1989 to join the existing malt house to the engine shed. We bought this as a separate building because that was owned by the local authority, as I say, originally built to house the steamroller which used to go round doing all the roads. Be quite useful today, wouldn't it? Have a steamroller, fill in the potholes. Anyway, so this is the malt house. Again, this is the museum, and that was extended through there. This is the new entrance where the shop is, and that's the engine shed, which is now the education room. So in order to make sure people knew when it was done, these castings were made to hold the whole building together. As I say, this again was arranged by Lawrence Stevens. Now inside the mill, when someone goes in and gets a guided tour, they're able to start at the top with the sack hoist. So this is the sack hoist which brings the heavy sacks up from the bottom to the top. As I say earlier, the idea is to follow the process through the mill from the grain coming in to the flour going out at the bottom. So this is the sack hoist. It's a friction drive sack hoist here, which pulls up the sacks from the bottom through trapdoors, and then the whole contents are tipped into the bins. And then the next floor down is spout floor. There's a series of cogs. All these have been renewed, by the way, because the original ones had woodworm in them. So when we started to turn them, they used to break off. So this is a new set made by Mr. Holder, one of our very skilled volunteers who made all these cogs. This is the drive down to the spout floor and to the third pair of stones, the ones in 1862. And this is the bevel arrangement from the top down to the lay shaft. So the lay shaft, which is this green lay shaft, is where the belt drives come from to drive all the ancillary machinery, because once the grinding's been done in the stones, you've still got to separate the bran from the flour and various husks and things to get rid of any surplus that you don't want to go into the bread. So that is the lay shaft there. And we have also down in the spout floor the Eureka combined scouring and separating machine. The Society magazine, which is called the Spout, is covering these machines at the moment, as different editions come out. There's another machine is described, and this one is made in Silver Creek, New York. It cost £39 when it was installed in 1883, so quite a bit of money. We know that because we've got the bill of sale for this particular machine. It used to be driven by the wind, but in order to show people how it works, we've installed an electric motor, tried to hide it away, but that's the electric motor that drives it. Makes a bit of a noise, but people are quite keen to see it running. Later, of course, they didn't need to use those machines at all because the separating the grain from the dust was done by the thrashing machine outside. So this is a typical thrashing machine by Marshalls of Gainsborough, driven by a traction engine. That would have been how it was done in the old days. And that replaced the Eurekas. There's quite a lot of Eureka machines around in different mills, water mills and windmills, but ours is quite useful to see. Now by 1992, we wanted to celebrate the 175th anniversary, so the marquee was erected in the piece of land opposite the mill entrance, and various pennants were put up in order to celebrate it. And again, Duke of Devonshire came as guest of honour, so he was very interested in the windmill before he passed away. and we put in the date here, 1817, there, so that people would realise why we knew it was the 175th anniversary. In between times, the museum was further enhanced with various exhibits, like this lantern pinion, and also the guide here to show how the stones work, because we have two sets of stones facing each other, which act as cutting edges in order to grind the grain into flour. We've also been given exhibits over the years. This is from Mr. Hode, Bexhill Post Mill. As you can see, it's rather worn and had woodworm in it, but this was a jack which he used to lift the mill up to get more wind. Because the mill blew down many years ago, he decided to give us various parts of the mechanism. The mill came quite famous because it was painted by L.S. Lowry in I don't know when it was painted. Anyway, when he was in Bexhill, he painted Hode's Mill, but unfortunately, as I say, it's all gone apart from the base nowadays. The original painting, which must be worth quite a bit of money now, being a Lowry, is in the Bexhill Museum. Various other machines have come our way, including the Coleman and Morton corn screen. This was given to us from the mill at Glynde. Now this wasn't a watermill or a windmill, this was a power mill driven by steam. So that was given to us, and we've now got it in the museum, and various other exhibits to explain the spring sails and also the Cubbett's patent mechanism, which was a later version. So these are all in the museum, which is why the museum is quite well received by visitors. Grain measures, these are grain measures in pints and bushels, and this is being refurbished at the time I took this photograph, some years ago now. And then this is the current magazine of the Eastbourne District Preservation Trust. So this is separate, of course, from the Eastbourne Society's magazine, and it tells you all about different events that are coming on. And some of the events are fairly regular, like the fetes, but we also have other events like dog shows and things like that in the mill or on the mill field outside. Now in 2002, Lawrence Stevens and others decided it's about time we started to grind flour again, and so in order to do that, we took the stones off the 1862 installation and had them dressed, that is, chipping out the grooves, in order to start the process of getting ready to do some grinding. Unfortunately, this has never happened, the grinding, because people lost interest, people died, all sorts of things, so we haven't actually got around to doing that. But that was quite an effort. We had to put RSJs in and lift these stones up, because they're quite heavy. That's why when I show people around, I say, well, they are quite heavy, you shouldn't have one around your neck. So we then decided to, or Lawrence decided to go to the Heritage Lottery Fund, see if we can get some money, and we used that to reclad the sweeps, redo the tower, redo the cap, everything. So it needed the scaffolding so that we could get to the top, or the contractors could. So this was quite a major step forward, and people often ask, did we ever get any money from the lottery? Well, you can get money from the lottery providing you've got someone who knows how to apply. So here's the scaffolding, so enabled access to the tower and the sweeps. And here's Lawrence and myself on the fan staging, painting the fan in October 2004. So it's quite useful having the scaffolding up, because we could go up the steps and do this painting without having to hang over the edge, which would have been quite dangerous. And here is Lawrence Stevens doing some pointing, with the lime mortar. Don't use cement, of course, lime mortar as originally decided. Of course, the windmill is Grade 2 star listed, so you have to comply with all the regulations on the mill. Now, also from Glyne, you saw the Coleman and Morton machine. We also had a Whitmore and Binion. Whitmore and Binion were quite a well-known company in Suffolk who made all this sorts of machinery. So we're quite fortunate to be able to have this machine in our museum collection. And also a Christian Norris machine, which this came from Morning's Mill, I think, yeah. So not from Glyne. And then there's a J.C. Bamford machine in there. Again, I don't quite know where this came from. It suddenly appeared. But J.C. Bamford, of course, eventually became JCB. This is the grinding machine for flour. And then getting more or less up to date, July 2007, we decided to replace the sweeps again. In order to do this, we asked various other mills if they could provide volunteers. There's a lot of liaison between different windmills through the Sussex Mills Group. And here's various people. This is Michael Chapman, passed away, I'm afraid, but he used to be a volunteer at Stone Cross Mill and also at Windmill Hill. And here's the sweeps being readied to go up onto the mill in July 2007, and also down on the ground where they've been repaired and repainted, ready to go back. A volunteer decided it's time to mow the grass as well. So that's quite useful actually. This, as I say, this field has been used for all sorts of activities. And here's me again, drilling holes in the handrail. So this is the gallery, so you can go right the way around the mill to go into the other doors. And all these are stainless steel, so they don't start rusting. And May 2009, just put in more work in. This is the striker rod, goes through the centre of the wind shaft. This is Tim Martin, one of our volunteers who also works for the National Trust. So he's quite a skilled chappie. And the last sweep is just going up, no, the second to last. There's still the one on the top to do. We did have, we were quite fortunate many years ago to have a volunteer who was a mountaineer. And so he used to swarm up the sweeps with no problem. And when he got to do the top here, he just went up rather than rotate it and do it from the bottom. So just hanging on to the sweeps. He had all the ropes and all the gear to do that. So just as a final look at the events that sometimes take place, these are Longman Morris men. They usually come on National Mills Day, which is in May, near the beginning of May each year, although they haven't been lately, well, because of COVID and other things. So this is at the front of the mill, the path that goes along. And sometimes we have the classic cars come into the plot, and you can see it's a fairly big area there for the classic cars to take part. We also have our own stationary engine. This is a Ruston and Hornsby stationary engine which Bob King used to look after and take it around to different events. This is Magnificent Motors. Used to also take it to Who Motor Club annual event at Who and various other events around the country. So that was useful publicity for the windmill. And then I mentioned the engine shed here. This is the end view of the engine shed. We did have someone recently who wanted to use the engine shed for their Thornycroft lorry restoration, but he didn't realise that the engine shed only goes for a few feet before it comes to the education room. So there's no room in there for that. And this is Pat Stevens, the late Pat Stevens, with a plant sale at one of the fetes. We also had, sometimes still do, children's events, mainly on Wednesdays in August, and they're trained or taught to make windmills from various things like toilet rolls and things like that, to give them some craft action there. The children also like to play with this. This is a quern, an early quern, which they can put grain in the top, wind it round, quite heavy to move, and the flour all comes out there, and it drops down into there where they can take it home and try and make some bread. It's very difficult because you've only got a small amount. And then finally the 200th anniversary, obviously 2017, it was 200 years since the mill was built. We had a bit of an event there, put pennants up around the sweeps. This is obviously the gallery there, and had a timeline display in the education room. This is the television which plays videos all the time about mills, not only Polegate but also tide mills and water mills and things like that. And the 200th anniversary cake was made, I think Bertha made this, Bertha Terry, with the September the 16th, 1817, which appears on one of the millstones. And we invited Maria Caulfield along, MP, and she came along and actually cut the cake. You can't see her hand, but it's there, cutting the anniversary cake. And cream teas and things were available on that day as well. And here is Lawrence with the sales stand. Over the years, we've introduced various souvenirs that people can buy to take home with them as a souvenir of their visit to Polegate Windmill. I'm having a break, have a cup of tea. Yeah, the teas are quite useful for income, of course, but it does take you away from doing what you're supposed to be doing. And this is Rilva with her higher or lower cards as part of the Fate fun. We do try to have events all the time, but in recent years it hasn't been possible. This is the last real event I think we had before the pandemic, the Fun Dog Show, which was quite successful. And we sometimes have the singers and the bands playing in the plot next to the mill. So this is the back of the museum here, and that's the malt house. And then we were proud to receive from Councillor Pritchett this award for best blooms, because we do have daffodils in the field, and when they come up at this time of year, they look quite good. And then various visits. This is the International Monological Society in 2014. That's the international enthusiasts organisation for mill enthusiasts. Now, unfortunately, sometimes we have a bit of a surprise or a shock. One of these was suddenly this path outside, which was a rural stone path, suddenly appeared to be tarmacked, which we didn't really go with, but then we never did find out who did it. So it was just a path appeared, no one in the area, the neighbours didn't know anything about it. And in a similar vein, suddenly this fence appeared as well, blocking off our car park. So we used to park along here on the grass, but this fence suddenly appeared, and we had a word with the owner of the house, because he's obviously expanded his garden. He said, oh no, it was all arranged with the windmill, but we never did find out who he arranged it with. It was possibly Lawrence Stevens, but he'd passed away by then, so we couldn't really ask him. So we're stuck now with this path and also the fence, although I understand from Jevington Council that the fence is only temporary for 5 years, so we'll have to see how that pans out. We've had some success recently with refurbishing the area. So this is the outside of the museum, which was getting a bit tatty. In fact, I think Lionel told us about it. He's spotted this. So we've had contractors in to repaint it. We could have done it ourselves, but of course, with less and less volunteers each year, we have less and less possibility of operating or doing anything with the mill. But recently, we've had a new millwright who's done various other mills, notably in Essex, but he came along and inspected the mill and has given us a report on what is necessary to replace all these items, which are trying to take out the foliage from the tower, and he's removed the fan blades in October last year and taken them away, so there's no fan on the back. And we're due to have a meeting with him to decide what parts of the condition report we can have done, because the whole lot is costed at £117,000, which of course we haven't got. So we just have to choose which parts we can do. But in any case, we're still short of volunteers to show people around, even if we're able to get that done. There's also the issue of the gallery, that's all sagging down, so there's quite a lot to do in order to get it back into a reasonable condition. This is one of those joints which went in to the tower, it's rotted away as it enters the tower, so quite a lot to do. So that brings you up to date on Polegate Windmill. I hope it's been of interest to everyone, and hopefully you'll be able to see the connection between the Polegate Windmill and the Eastbourne Society. Thank you very much.